The afternoon was darker than usual at the park, with heavy clouds casting unnatural shadows across the grounds. Mordecai and Rigby were in their musty room, watching a wrestling match on an old TV with a cracked screen that flickered intermittently. The sound was distorted, creating macabre echoes of the wrestlers' screams that seemed to reverberate longer than they should have. "Dude, this beef burrito is so weak," Rigby muttered, holding a worn-out doll with a partially disfigured face. The buttons that served as eyes hung by loose threads, swaying with each movement like tiny pendulums marking time until something terrible would happen. During their mock fight with the doll, Rigby stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he tried to maintain balance, but momentum carried him violently into the wall behind him. A hollow sound echoed through the room, followed by a sinister creaking. That seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves. When they looked, there was an irregular hole in the wall, but something was fundamentally wrong about it. The hole didn't show the building's exterior or even the framework they expected to see. It was just darkness, a thick, impenetrable darkness. That seemed to move and pulse like a living thing, breathing with malevolent intent. "Dude, Benson's gonna kill us if he finds out about this," Mordecai groaned, approaching the hole with growing unease. A cold, fetid breeze blew from the opening, carrying the unmistakable smell of rotting flesh, mixed with something else, something sweet and cloying that made their stomachs turn. The odor seemed to cling to their nostrils, refusing to dissipate. Even when they backed away, desperate for money to fix the wall before something crawled out of that dark void, the two wandered through the park in the fading light. The familiar paths seemed different somehow, longer and more winding than usual, with shadows that moved independently of their sources. They walked for what felt like hours before finally encountering a hunched figure behind a cluster of overgrown bushes near the park's forgotten maintenance shed. That it wasn't an ordinary wizard or even an ordinary person. It was something that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. Its skin was gray and peeling like old wallpaper, revealing patches of necrotic muscle underneath that glistened weightily in the dim light. Its eyes were empty black holes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and when it slowly turned its head toward them with jerky, unnatural movements, its mouth opened to reveal multiple rows of irregular, rotten teeth that clicked together rhythmically. "Do you want the power?" the creature hissed, its voice like broken glass being ground together, each word accompanied by a wet, rasping sound. An ancient keyboard lay on the ground beside the thing, its surface covered in a dark, viscous substance that seemed to move of its own accord, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Rigby, always impulsive and never one to consider consequences, reached out and grabbed the keyboard without hesitation. The moment his fingers made contact with the keys, they adhered to his skin like hot tar, the plastic and metal seemingly melting and fusing with his flesh. He screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the park, but no matter how hard he pulled and twisted, he couldn't separate himself from the cursed instrument. Back in their room, the keyboard had become a permanent part of Rigby's body, its edges seamlessly merged with his hands and wrists. Black veins had begun spreading up his arms, like infected root systems, pulsing with each beat of his increasingly rapid heartbeat. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes had begun to develop dark rings around them that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. "Maybe we can use this to get a raise," Mordecai suggested desperately, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while watching his best friend undergo a horrific transformation. But even as he spoke, he could feel something changing in the air around them, a pressure that made his ears pop and his vision blur at the edges. When Rigby finally worked up the courage to play the first notes and muttered, "We want a raise," the sound that emerged from the keyboard wasn't music at all. Instead, it was a cacophony of screams of agony, despair, and torment that seemed to come from 1,000 different voices, all crying out in unison. The sound waves rippled visibly through the air, distorting reality as they passed, and leaving behind a taste of copper and sulfur. Within minutes, Benson appeared at their door, but it was immediately clear that something was catastrophically wrong. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his tie hung crooked, and his gumballs were clouded over like cataracts. Most disturbing of all were his eyes completely white and rolled back, showing only the bloodshot sclera. His mouth moved independently. Of his will, the words emerging in a voice that definitely wasn't his own. Of course, you deserve a raise. You deserve everything. You deserve what's coming. The infection spread rapidly throughout the park after that first use of the keyboard. Every person they attempted to control with its power became an empty shell, a puppet dancing to the tune of something far more sinister than they had initially realized. Pops began laughing incessantly, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that never stopped, not even when he slept. Tears of blood streamed constantly down his cheeks, staining his usually pristine clothes with crimson streaks that formed disturbing patterns. The ghost, usually a jovial presence despite his incorporeal nature, simply vanished entirely one day, leaving behind only a spreading stain of ectoplasm on the ground where he'd been standing. The stain whispered constantly in voices that belonged to people who had been dead for decades, reciting names, dates, and locations of deaths that had occurred throughout the park's long and apparently dark history. When they decided to test the keyboard's power further by making Skips disappear as what they thought would be a harmless prank, the results were far more horrifying than anything they had imagined. Skips didn't simply vanish or get transported to some other location. He was violently pulled into the black hole in their wall. His massive form somehow compressed and twisted as he was dragged through an opening that should have been far too small to accommodate him. His screams echoed from within the void for hours afterward, gradually becoming more distant and distorted until they no longer sounded human at all, eventually fading into something that resembled the mournful howling of wind through a vast, empty space dot. As days passed and Rigby's physical condition continued to deteriorate, his memories began to shift and change in ways that defied explanation. Conversations he was certain had happened began to feel like dreams, while dreams started to feel more real than his waking moments. He began to realize with growing horror that they hadn't accidentally made that hole in the wall during their wrestling match. Something had been trying to escape from within the walls for weeks, maybe months, leaving scratches in the paint, gnawing at the wood and plaster during the night, and whispering things in languages that predated human speech. The keyboard, he now understood, had never been meant to give them power over anything. It was a conduit, a feeding tube that allowed whatever lurked on the other side of reality to draw sustenance from their world. Each note played, each command given, each person controlled had fed the entity, allowing it to manifest more completely in their dimension and gain stronger influence over the physical world around them. One morning, Mordecai discovered a diary. Hidden beneath his bed, a diary written in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of ever writing in it. The pages contained detailed accounts of the same events playing out over and over again: watching wrestling on TV, fighting with the beef burrito doll, accidentally creating the hole in the wall, finding the keyboard, using its power, and watching everything fall apart. The handwriting became increasingly frantic and desperate with each iteration, as if the writer had been slowly losing his sanity while being forced to document the same nightmare repeatedly. "How many times have we done this?" Mordecai whispered to himself, flipping through hundreds of pages that all told the same story with minor variations. Some entries mentioned details he couldn't remember, conversations with people who worked at the park but whom he'd never seen, references to events that felt familiar but remained frustratingly out of reach, and increasingly desperate attempts to break free from what the diary's author clearly recognized as some kind of supernatural prison. The final entry was different from all the others. Written in what appeared to be dried blood rather than ink, the letters shaky and barely legible. We realized today. Skips never worked here. Benson died years ago in the fire. This park closed in 1987 after the accident. We're the only ones here. We've always been the only ones here. And the thing in the wall, ... it's us. It's what we became after dying in. The fire. We're feeding on ourselves, trapped in an endless loop of our own death and resurrection, forced to experience our final moments over and over again for eternity. When Mordecai looked up from the diary to share this revelation with Rigby, his friend had vanished entirely. In the spot where Rigby had been standing, only the cursed keyboard remained on the floor, but it had changed again. The keys were no longer made of plastic and metal. They had transformed into human teeth, yellowed and cracked, each one bearing traces of blood and tissue at its roots. The keyboard's body had taken on the texture and appearance of bone, and when he looked closer, Mordecai could see that it was breathing. Desperate for answers, he stumbled to the cracked mirror that hung on their wall and looked at his reflection. What stared back at him was not the blue jay he remembered being, but a charred and blackened corpse with skin that hung in tatters, revealing bone and muscle beneath. His eyes were empty sockets that wept a continuous stream of dark fluid, and his beak was broken, hanging at an unnatural angle. He had been dead for years, decades, perhaps, and yet somehow he continued to exist, trapped in this decaying shell, and forced to relive the same traumatic events endlessly. The hole in the wall began to close with agonizing slowness, the darkness retreating inch by inch. From the other side, he could hear the voices of everyone who had disappeared. Rigby screaming for help, Skips begging to be released from whatever torment he was experiencing, Benson repeating the same meaningless corporate jargon about responsibility and productivity in an endless loop that had become a form of torture in itself. All of them were trapped together in that void, experiencing their own personal versions of hell while being forced to interact with each other in ways that only amplified their suffering. Mordecai realized with crushing certainty that he was the last soul still clinging to this mockery of reality, the final witness to their collective damnation. Tomorrow, he would wake up again in his room, his memories of this revelation already beginning to fade like morning mist. He would watch wrestling with Rigby as if for the first time they would fight with the doll, create the hole in the wall, encounter the creature with the keyboard, and set in motion the same chain of events that had been playing out for countless iterations. But this time was different, because now he knew the truth about their situation. He understood that every choice they made had already been made before, that every word they spoke had been spoken countless times, that every moment of hope or despair was just another note in an endless, discordant symphony of suffering. This knowledge wouldn't save him or change anything about their fate, but it would make every repeated moment infinitely more excruciating, because he would be aware of the futility while being powerless to alter their course. The screen faded to black, and in that darkness only the sound of the keyboard remained. It played a melody that had no beginning and would have no end, each note a distorted echo of human anguish, transformed into something resembling music, but fundamentally wrong in ways that defied description. The credits rolled in complete silence, except for that haunting, never-ending tune, and viewers were left to wonder whether they had just witnessed a story or been made complicit in the endless torment of souls who could never truly die.